First of all, it's probably important to say that my relationship with media art, if such a thing ever exists, is one of a theoretical person, not of an artist. So I'm not doing art myself. I'm curating and researching art. And then the term of media art has become somewhat problematic over the last years, and there are people who would even say that there is no such thing as media art, because it's absurd. Every art deals with media, but the media, of course, means new media, but then which media is really new? And many of those media termed new are old nowadays. So it's kind of a problematic term, but it's probably still useful to address a certain group of works for exhibitions or this kind of things. But I actually liked very much the term you use here, which is arte tecnologia, because it's much less defining a genre, but defining a process or what you do. So you do art with technology, and it doesn't define which kind of technology, but it's rather obvious that it's probably not painting, but it could be. It could be painting combined with something digital. So I kind of like this term. And then now, if we make it a little bit more personal, then I started to work with what we could call media art in the early 2000s, and since then I'm curating and researching, but not every kind of media art, more or less, like of the audiovisual realm, performances, but also installations and those things. And I'm very much into film too, so also experiments with film that go beyond the traditional cinema. And then that's also where the mixed realities come in, because I've been working a lot about documentary and documentary practices and reality. The reference to reality is one major point of every documentary work, of course. And in this field of documentary practices, you have a lot of works, probably not coming from traditional documentary cinema, but coming from the arts or from dance or from theatre, that work with mixed realities. Yes, my relationship with technology, that's a funny question. Because when I started to study in the 90s, I did my first student's paper still on my father's typewriter called Carina. So that was very far away from new media and computer and the digital, but then of course the digital came even to the humanities, and we started to work with them. And then when I got interested in contemporary art forms, there it was, of course, the technology. And I always thought, or we in the framework of fluctuating images always thought that it's important not only to look at the artworks and curate them, but also to understand the technology and how it works as well as we could understand it. So I would kind of follow presentations of VJ software or try to understand how certain technologies would work, so I could better analyze also the works that were presented. I think there's a big difference between how it's organized in Brazil and how it's organized in Germany, for example. You have those fixed research groups and people would come and go, but the research group somehow stays, and it's not necessarily linked to funds. We have also this kind of research group, but it depends very much on people, and it's not as normal as it seems to be here to me. And research groups in Germany very often are linked to funds. So, for example, the German Research Foundation, the DFG, founds networks of researchers, and that runs kind of 3-4 years. So you have a specific topic, people from different universities, even from outside Germany, would work together, gather around this topic, do a conference, publish a book in the end, and then this would be the end of the research group. This is probably the most normal format, that it's somehow linked to funds. But you can always have the phenomenon. We, for example, in Hamburg try to establish something called the Doc Art Lab. But it's very hard work, and when we have a meeting, people won't come because suddenly they have to teach or have another meeting. So it's not an established thing where you know, like Monday from 2 to 4, I will go to my research group. You have to try to make it fit into the system somehow. And then what is very normal is that you have research groups, for example, for the PhD students. But they don't have a subject, but everybody can come and present. But this, practically every university has this kind of group. At the university in Stuttgart, there was a research group of the professors and the Faculty of the Humanities, which was a really amazing exception, because we never heard of that anywhere else. It was called Work in Progress, and it was a group that would gather like 2 or 3 times during the semester, and professors and also the other academic staff would present their research, their new research, and everybody would discuss about it. And it would not happen at the university, but every time another professor would invite people to his home and provide dinner. So it was a very nice context also to discuss, and one that's maybe a bit freer and less critical and less political also than the university. Just a free space to present a new research without having to be afraid of being attacked at once, because everybody was sitting there with a glass of wine, being happy, and also happy to discuss things in a more open way.
This group doesn't exist anymore?
It was like decades. It existed before we started to study, and then I was at that university for like 15 years, so and it existed the whole time. And then afterwards, I don't know. And it was also very well thought, you know. It was not the researchers and the younger academic staff who had to invite and to provide for dinner. It was the big professors with the big salary who did that. So that was kind of a social thought behind it. No one ever spoke of it, but it was there. That was not an open group, on invitation only. Yeah, that was old school. That was on invitation only. If you were brilliant, you had a chance to be invited. Old school. What are the limits of reality? Good question. Well, I think you can push reality in artworks, working with a reference to reality. You can push it to its boundaries and try to stretch it, to expand it, and get it as loose as possible. But there comes the point when it probably explodes and there is no relation to reality anymore, and it's clear that it's kind of fictional and that it can't be. Well, if you look at the definition of augmented reality, it is linked to computer and to the digital. You could use it in a metaphoric way, and then it's probably possible to de-link it from computer and the digital, but the normal traditional definition would link it to computation and the realm of the digital. Well, if you go out of Europe and the US, the use of technology is sometimes very, very different, and the approach to technology is very different, because if you, for example, you look at Africa, it is as if they jumped a period. So suddenly the computer and the digital and all the devices are there. So it's another kind of approach, of course. And then the mixed realities or the more augmented realities that will be built are also different. Like if you think about what is usual in the commodified world in Europe and the US, so things that are designed for a certain market, they follow a certain logics, which is the dominant logics of the dominant discourse. For example, I came upon a huge discussion about hair in video games, African hair in video games. They only had, like, for a very long time, like, let's say 2 types of braids, and that was that. And all African people just looked the same and had the same hair. So that would be something that would be typical for the European or the US design. And I guess that if you looked at Africa, they would think about it, how the hair looks, because, you know, they wouldn't follow the predominant discourse. And then sometimes there is a more DIY attitude towards the technology. So also here in Brazil, you have this more DIY attitude, trying to do things with technology, subvert it, and because not always everything is ready and there. I think that is why lately so many people have become interested in what's happening in Africa, because all over Africa, in many countries, the artists and the creative scene try to develop their own approach, another approach that does not copy the Western approach and the Western aesthetics, and to define an own aesthetics. And probably, like, the colonial topic is very, very different here, of course, than it is in Africa. So there it's more important to decolonialize aesthetics and to make a distance and define an own aesthetics. But still, that it makes it so interesting that they do, and so fresh, and things come out of those countries where you are really, really astonished, because it's a different aesthetics, one you couldn't have thought of in Europe, because it just doesn't fit with European tradition of thinking, for example. And I think there could be something. I was missing this also a little bit, because USP is very far from all African Brazilian tradition. Of course, there are people working on it, but it doesn't really feel. And then it's not a majority in São Paulo, true, but it could be more visible and could be probably more part of the academic discourse and what's done here in academia. It's an off topic that I was getting very angry when I realized that in my design course in Bremen, I had more Africans than are here in the classes, which is totally absurd, because in Germany there are probably 1% of people of African descent, or let it be 2. Yes, if I have a course and there are 2 African people, that's already way over the percentage. And I was thinking that this is really, really strange here, especially in USP. And last week I went to Vitória. Of course, it's completely different there. It's just this elite thing here. But I think this elite thing should think about its way of approaching this kind of topics. I'm allowed to say that because I'm not part of the hierarchy, right? Well, for a very long time, the German system was very resistant against the mixture of the theoretical and the practical in art. But I think it has become kind of normal, and you have also now the practice-based PhD in some art schools, and some art schools have become universities, so it's much more mixed. But even in other institutions, you have very often the mixture between, for example, an artist presents a work, and then there would also be someone from the theoretical side and do an interview or a discussion in an off space, for example. And it has become very usual that you have conferences, and you would also invite artists to the conferences. Maybe not as many artists as researchers, but there would be either a presentation, a performance, or artists talking, depending on what they want to do. Well, we are not directly working on ecological topics, like content-wise, but an ecological thought, if you deal with design, for example, or with technology, you can always have an ecological approach without the ecological being a topic of the artworks you show. So we would try, for example, to be, now I say the word that everyone hates nowadays, sustainable. And I was very impressed that, for example, in Austria, there's a possibility to certify festivals as sustainable, which does not only mean sustainable in an ecological, but also in a social way. So you wouldn't do the hire and fire thing anymore. And you wouldn't have plastic cups for the coffee and so on. So those little things. And this is certainly something we try to think about. And then I think that everything we do is also embedded in a certain kind of political approach, even if there can be a performance that is not openly political, but there is a political framework, which is very important. Audiovisual performance in Brazil, at first sight, is not so different from audiovisual performance internationally, because if you have an abstract aesthetics, that's kind of an international aesthetics, but then it's not only the aesthetics that make the performances, but also the setting, where they happen, who's doing them. And I think it's important there is the link to the international scene, because Brazilian artists travel a lot, they perform abroad, and then also a lot of people from abroad come to Brazil and perform, so there's an exchange, which is not the case everywhere probably. And what is very important here in the audiovisual scene is that it's also rooted. So, for example, Mirella and Webb, they have the house, so they are rooted in the artist community of São Paulo. They do work at home and present at home in São Paulo. And I think that's kind of interesting, because not everybody does that. And you have a lot of artists in Berlin, for example, that practically never show in Berlin, because there are very little opportunities, there's little money, so you're more likely to see them performing in Colombia or in Uzbekistan than in Berlin, probably. And this is very interesting that you have this rootedness here, this wish also to do things here in place, to do festivals, to do spaces. Of course you have in Germany and Europe, you have spaces, but that is something that is striking, I think. And then what is also interesting is the link to discourse, that it's very much linked to an academic discourse and an academic research, and is happening in exchange with the academic discourse and research. This is much less happening in Europe, for example. You would have some conferences that deal with the topic, but very, very little, and it's mostly the festivals doing it. Like, for example, the Soundframe Festival in Vienna that had to close down 2 years ago, I think. And they always had a theoretical section. They had a lot of theoretical texts in their catalogs, for example. So they were trying to do this link that here is done more by academia itself.